we have a bunch of examples here in our main explainer, but they kind of look like this. Our goal is to introduce this new API on event target called when, and I'll actually share this in the spec. And it basically looks like this. It's called when, and it sits alongside add event listener and remove event listener. It takes an event type and then some like listeners.
We are very excited to have Dominic Farolino from the Chrome team joining us. How are you doing, Dominic?
I'm great. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you for coming. Welcome, welcome. Ben Lesh was telling us all about you. He said we needed to meet you. He said you were very handsome. I don't know why he said that. He said that.
I saw that clip on Twitter and I was like, okay.
Yeah, he's a lot of fun. And then he also said that you were working on this proposal that we're very excited to hear more about. So we're going to hear about that. And then we also, and if we're lucky, Ben is going to pop in and join us tonight. Always fun to see Ben. And then we also have Alex and Pawel from the Angular team. How are y'all doing? Hello, hello. Live from NG Poland, right?
Yeah, wrapped up kind of like conference stuff. So now we're here to just hang out.
Nice. Shout out to the NG Poland organizers. Love those guys. And before we get started, I just want to give a quick shout out to our sponsors, AG Grid. Thank you so much for helping us have these awesome conversations. We've got some really cool people from our group tonight here to learn more about the Observable API. Okay, so let's start first with Dominic. What is your motivation for, because Ben had, so what I heard was that Ben had done this proposal quite like years ago, right? And it just kind of was there and nobody really did anything with it. And then you picked it up and ran with it. Yay. And so what was your motivation and like what made you decide to do that?
Well, I've always been interested in like pretty low level primitives on the platform and promises, the whole promise workflow with like massive community precedent and then like the long arduous standards tract and standards process. That was always really interesting and inspiring to me. And a while ago when I was in college and working on Chrome open source, I saw, observables being discussed and it seemed really interesting. And, the initial framing was like promises, but for multiple events with some different semantics. And that seemed pretty cool to me. And I followed the original issue that Ben filed, and I thought it was really cool. There's tons of developer hype about it. It's actually the #1 reacted to web standards issue on GitHub right now, which is like a narrow slice of issues on the web. I mean, web standards issues, but people are excited about it. Developers want the primitive. There's a lot of community precedent around it. And I kind of saw it sit quiet for a long time. And I was wrapping up a project last year, and I was looking for sort of the next thing to work on. And observables has always kind of been in the back of my mind. And I had met Ben at a few conferences, and so I was kind of like, all right, like let's just do it. Let's just try and just do it all and get it done. And I think it was just really, it had the tacit approval from all the vendors, and the developers were excited about it. It just needed an engineer to work on it. And so I talked with my manager and was like, I kind of want to do this. And he was like, okay, and that was that.
Yay. So you got it working?
Yeah, it's almost done. It hasn't been my main project, so it's like I've sort of fallen short of the original deadlines that I've set for myself. But no, it's coming. It's really close to being done. We had a bunch of really good design discussions at the last 2 TPAC events, which are basically the large like web standards conferences that happen once a year for anybody to participate in, but a lot of browser engineers. And so we worked out a lot of the kinks of the proposal, and I'm hoping to basically get it landed in Chrome stable in the next couple months is my goal. It's pretty much almost there. So it's great to have these kinds of events to chat with people about them and show kind of what's coming and how our proposal in the browser varies slightly from the precedent that has been established in userland, and basically evangelize the API a bit more. So yeah.
Can you show us?
I can show you, yeah.
Yes, please.
Let me share. I have just a few slides to go through just to visualize some stuff. We'll do some coding. But I think what you mentioned, Bonnie, was like a big part of what we want to get out of this is talking about how we can get feedback from people on the proposal and some of the more sharper edges of this proposal, or some of the more contentious points. So we'll go through some slides and some examples, but I really want to show people like, here are the big decisions that we could use feedback on, and direct people to teach them how to give that feedback and where to go. So I'll share my screen. we can go
I
through
love,
some.
I love having these conversations. Same with the Angular team when we're having these conversations at the point when it's a proposal, when it's an RFC, because you're inviting feedback. It's not finalized yet. It's so fun.
Yeah, it's chaotic for sure. I'll go through a brief history. First off, can we all see this?
Yes.
Is this visible? Okay. I'm not even going to go to full presenter mode. I'll just kind of like go here, but people can see these slides. It's all good, right?
Yes.
Okay. So as you mentioned, I think back in 2015, Ben Lesh had originally proposed the Observable API, which I'm assuming people are familiar with in RxJS and Angular code bases, as a TC39 proposal. So put it into the JavaScript language. For many reasons, we ended up moving that in 2017, a couple years later, to the What Working Group standards organization. This is pretty much web platform APIs that are layered on top of the JavaScript language. And then last year, I started this YCG repository, which is kind of like an incubator standards sort of organization for new APIs in the ideation phase that are eventually going to get upstreamed into What Working Group specs. And so that's kind of where the observable proposal lives right now. I'll show you more about this later, but the actual proposal is like live on GitHub. It's under the YCG observable repository here. And we'll talk about what's in this repository and how you can give feedback. So let's see. Okay, I want to talk about just the web platform integration and how our observable proposal like kind of looks and feels. Just to make sure the screen sharing is working. Like you can see this tab, right? The YCG repository tab. Is that right?
I see it. Yeah, observable. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So we have a bunch of examples here in our main explainer, but they kind of look like this. Our goal is to introduce this new API on event target called when, and I'll actually share this in the spec. And it basically looks like this. It's called when, and it sits alongside add event listener and remove event listener. It takes an event type and then some like listeners for handling the events. But the real key here is that it returns an observable, and the observable is what allows you to sort of declaratively establish this pipeline of operators that events will flow through. And so we have a bunch of examples in our GitHub repository. This is the YCG repository that show literally how this is going to work. I mean, our goal is to be able to, have an element call .when on it, which gives you an observable that represents an unbounded stream of, in this case, click events. And then you can run things like filter and map, and then eventually subscribe to them and pass in a handler that all the events that finally make it through this handler get processed through all the operators in between here. And so this is like exactly what it looks like. We have all kinds of operators that we'll discuss here in a bit, but there's a bunch of examples here in the spec that show how you can take all the mouse move events until you get the first mouse up event. You can do really fancy things with like WebSockets. Ben writes a lot of really good WebSocket examples that kind of illustrate how using observables with other primitives on the web would work in real life, and all kinds of stuff like that. We have, so all of this, the exciting thing about these examples is that they're all live in Chrome right now. So you can actually like run these, and I'll try and figure out how to share. Let me share the whole window real fast, just so I can get DevTools to be displayed here. But this is like, okay, can you guys see like DevTools and example.com? Okay, so example.com is like this super simple website. It's got like a header on here. Oops. And so if I grab the element and I call .when and pass in the event name click, this gives me an observable object that represents the stream of all click events that are targeting this element. And it's lazy like observables on the web today with userland libraries. And I can subscribe to it like source.subscribe and literally just console log the pointer event. And so when I go over here and I start clicking on the header, basically I'm able to console log and process all the events that I want. And so that's like a really, really like watered down simple version of kind of what we're dealing with. So we have the when method and the subscribe method. But we've got all kinds of operators that we're baking in with the observable proposal. Things that we saw a little bit alluded to before, like map and filter and flat map. And we have two sort of categories of operators. We've got the observable returning ones and the promise returning ones. I'll do a quick example of the promise returning operators. So here's a quick example of like an observable that pretty much every 200 milliseconds just emits another value, like a monotonically increasing stream of values, right? So if I run this and I create this observable, say this is obviously a toy example, but say this represents a stream of numbers, and I want to know if all of the numbers in the stream meet some criteria, and maybe the stream like never ends. I can subscribe to this observable, and I can use the every method and pass in this predicate. And I want to know if every single number in the stream is less than or equal to the value 5. And obviously the first 5 values that are going to be emitted here are going to be less than or equal to 5. But eventually we're going to hit a value 6, right? Like v++ up here is eventually going to give us 6 and then fail this operator. And so this is kind of how we use the promise returning operators. Every here returns a promise that represents a true or false value if all the streams match this criteria. So if I run this, it'll just take every 200 milliseconds until it gets the next value that breaks this condition, and then that promise will resolve to false, and then we print the value out here. So that's just a really quick example of how we use like the observables, the observable returning operators, and the promise returning operators. And that's a bit of a difference from how observables work in the real world right now in RxJS. All of the operators, I believe, in RxJS return observables, and we have this set of operators that are like, some of them are promise returning and some of them are observable returning. And this is another kind of feature of the API that we'd like to get feedback on at some point, especially from you all. I'll continue a little bit more with some design details. So like obviously the general subscription and consumption of values looks similar to this. You create a new observable with the constructor that we're exposing in Chrome, and with the subscriber you can just start piping in values by calling next. And when you subscribe, you can pass in your handler and handle those values. You don't just get access to the next method, like you get access to complete and error and a couple things like that on subscriber that help you handle regular next values, completions, and errors. All of this probably feels pretty familiar for people that know about observables. But one major design difference that we're having that in the native web platform proposal that I really want to talk about in terms of how it's going to interact with people's code bases is the idea of the hot and the cold observable. And in our case, what we've done with the multicasting producer. So I think a lot of people see these examples where if you have an observable whose producer is basically set interval, and maybe every 10 seconds it produces a value, I think a lot of people initially are surprised that when they subscribe to the observable and maybe nine out of the 10 seconds have passed, and you have one more second before a value gets emitted, and you subscribe to the same observable again, that second subscription will not get its next value in 1 second. It restarts the set interval, creates a new set interval, and 10 seconds from that subscription, another value will be emitted to that other consumer. So in other words, there's a one-to-one relationship between observable producer and observable consumer. And every single time you subscribe to the observable, you have the side effect of respinning up a new producer and then having your own consumer tied to that producer. And we've gotten some feedback from web developers that is a little confusing and error prone. And so we've decided to do to basically simplify this on the platform and make all observables have this multicasting ref counted producer. And I'll just show an example of how this looks here real fast. So imagine you have a producer that, again, just has a set interval every 500 milliseconds, produces a new value. The first time the first consumer comes along and subscribes to this, it's going to fire this callback and it's going to create a new interval that's going to emit values. But the second time you subscribe, you're actually just going to hook into that existing producer. You're not going to re-spin up a new set interval and a new 500 millisecond delay between values. You're just going to listen in on the same producer that's producing the first one. And that goes for all subsequent producers to the same observable. We've heard from developers that this is more predictable and makes it less error prone. If people were concerned that if you give someone an observable just through some API that you're not very familiar with, but you get an observable from it, if you subscribe to it, you don't actually know if you're going to produce side effects and spin up a whole new chain of producers that give you values, or if you're going to just tap into an existing producer and listen to things. So the idea of not knowing if your subscription has side effects or not was causing major performance issues in some really, really large web applications. And I actually want to see if that feedback generalizes and talk to you guys about that to see if that feedback is sound. And so what we've decided to do to fix that is to make all observables hot. I mean, they're lazy in the sense that this producer doesn't actually run until you first subscribe. The first consumer comes along and calls subscribe. But every other consumer past that just listens in to the pre-existing subscription. So it's guaranteed to not have any more side effects than one-time subscription. The second thing I'll just cover briefly is with cancellation and teardown, how our API works. I believe observables in RxJS have an unsubscribe method somewhere, I think. And like, I'm a fake web developer. I'm not a real web developer. So like, you have to excuse my lack of knowledge about all the APIs that you all use every day. And so we've decided though that to use the abort controller and abort signal mechanism for unsubscription for observables in the platform. So what this looks like is if you have a producer, for example, that again, it's just calls set interval and produces values every interval or something like that. The producer can tear down the set interval with the add teardown method that we're adding on subscriber. In this case, like, it just clears the interval, so it stops the producer from actually running. And the way the consumer can signal to the observable that, hey, I'm done listening to values, like stop producing them, is with an abort signal and an abort controller. So when you subscribe, you can actually pass in an abort signal, and then you can call abort controller abort, and then this actually runs all the teardowns associated with the consumer or with the producer to make sure it stops listening to values. So the way this works with the multicasted producer is that if you have three subscribers to the same producer, this producer function basically has a ref count, in this case of 3. And if the first consumer calls controller.abort on the controller whose signal gets passed into the subscription, basically we just reduce the ref count by 1, but we don't actually tear this down. We don't stop producing values. And if the second consumer does the same thing, we just reduce the ref count again to 1. And if the third one does it, the ref count hits 0, and then we finally actually tear down the guts of the producer. And that's pretty much all I wanted to cover, just in terms of some of the interesting details about the API design that we went with and some of the sharp edges there. One of the things I really want to get feedback on from people here, and it doesn't have to be synchronously in this conversation. I don't expect everyone to have completely absorbed the whole spec and everything right now. But is the idea of this ref counted producer, this is a big difference between how things work in RxJS and Angular world today. The promise returning APIs, we've heard some confusion that, like, man, like if I want to subscribe to an observable, I have to know like whether this observable operator returns a promise or an observable, and I have to remember which methods, like .every, does that return an observable or does that return a promise? And that can be confusing. I think it's somewhat intuitive. If the observable is supposed to resolve to a single value, it's a promise returning API. If not, it's observable. But there's some discussion about that, and I'd like to get people's feedback on that as well. And then the last thing is unsubscription semantics. Basically is calling abort controller.abort too clunky, or should we have like an actual unsubscribe method somewhere in the proposal? And the best way to like chat about this stuff, I mean, you can email me, you can DM me on Twitter, but also like on our GitHub repository here, we have a bunch of issues that are open, and we've gotten some really good feedback from the developer community so far. I've pinned the issues at the top of the repository that kind of highlight some of the sharper edges of the proposal and some of the things that I think could use some good input. One of them is, of course, we have a subscribe method, but we don't have an unsubscribe method. Abort controller is clunky. I don't want to use that. And so, we've had some good feedback about that, introducing a more ergonomic way to unsubscribe. And the other two have to do with the hot and cold behavior and the predictability about a ref counted producer, which is a significant difference from user land observables today. But just to highlight that difference one more time, one of the things we were seeing from developers is that they were getting, HTTP client returned observables from Angular, and they were not, and maybe they had gone through some processing and they weren't sure, or they weren't aware that subscribing to this observable would always kick off a new fetch request under the hood. And so maybe they would have some code that would cause a million different subscriptions to the same observable, and they wouldn't realize that this produces like a million different network requests under the hood, instead of basically sharing the same request. And that kind of thing was causing a lot of duplicate API requests or duplicate thrashing in different parts of the DOM. And so we wanted to resolve that issue in the platform and make it a little more predictable and easy to use. But yeah, the observable repository is where a lot of our work is being done. And we have this spec here, which describes like the whole API and the semantics of everything. And we've had some contributors to it as well. All the operators exist here and have a bunch of examples and tests. So this is kind of the central hub of work right now. And yeah, so we basically love a bunch of feedback on this. I'll stop rambling and we can chat about how people, how this might work and integrate with existing large code bases that use observables and soon signals and RxJS and everything like that. But hopefully that was at least a good enough overview to kind of frame the discussion.
It was awesome. I think I speak for all of us. Maybe we can see some emojis from the people here when I say we are so excited about the work that you're doing. So I think the first question will be, can we play with it right now? Where is it? It's in Canary.
Yeah, that's a good. Okay, I should have mentioned that. Yeah, let me just share my screen one more time.
Give it to us, Dominic. We want to play with it. And then I'm going to ask the Angular team. I'm interested to hear from them because, we love the Angular team and we nerd out with them a lot. How, if you actually get this up and running, which I think you will, how that would affect the work that they're doing. That's interesting.
So the first thing is, if you actually just go to Chrome://flags, in Chrome, this is like where you can enable all of our like exposed runtime APIs and that kind of thing. A lot of experimental work is in here, and one of them is the Observable API. So if you just search inside this flags text box, you'll see Observable or Atomic Move or whatever, different things that we're all working on. So one of them is observables, and you can flip this to enabled, and it'll make you restart Chrome, so probably don't do it right now. And this is, I'm actually running this in like Chrome stable. This is 131. The API has been around in Chrome for a good bit. So the most up-to-date version of the experimental API is going to be in Canary, because like if I land some code that messes with how observables work right now, you'll get it tomorrow in Canary. But the API experimentally exists in stable as well. It just lags behind Canary. So you can go to either Canary or stable or anything in between. Chrome ://flags and enable observables and start messing with it. I will caveat this with one thing: the whole ref counted producer like kind of whole design has been discussed, but it's not implemented yet. So observables as they exist in a browser right now in our implementation are much more like RxJS observables. Like they spin up a new producer every time you subscribe. That'll be changing at some point, assuming we all agree on the spec change and the design for that. but yeah, that's how you can use it today. And like I said, there's a bunch of code examples in the explainer on the repository, and I can throw a link into the chat here just to give people that. And all the examples should be runnable like right now in Chrome. And
This is so fun. It's like a new toy.
it's a new toy.
For us, it literally is a new toy. Literally.
Yeah. And so we're talking with Ben a lot as well about how his idea, his goal is to basically, he said this before, and like he wants to make RxJS pretty much Lodash for observables. Like get rid of the guts of the observable implementation and all the main meat of it, and just have a cute set of operators that sit on top of the native operators, that if you want some extra fancy toys on top of observables and some fancy operators that do, more interesting things that the browser does not bake in, you can use RxJS. But the idea is the next major version of RxJS would be backwards compatible with the native implementation on the web. And his goal is to basically slowly obsolete like the core guts of that library in exchange for the native version, because we think we have a lot of community hype about it and a lot of precedent with the shape of the API. And so that's sort of the motivation.
I love that. And it's hard to be worried like, well, they're going to deprecate RxJS eventually or whatever. But then this is Ben who's taking it forward. So it's not going anywhere. It's actually going right into the browser. It's not going away. I love this. And we love Ben. I feel like we should roast him because he's not here with us, but we love him. So
yeah, he's great. Now he's been like every step of the way with the proposal. He's been helping me design it, and he's gone to all the standards meetings with it. And so there should be no fear about your RxJS applications just breaking overnight because I added a bunch of stuff to the browser and deleted a bunch of stuff from RxJS. So we're working very closely with the community around this kind of stuff. But I think the biggest opportunity for discussion that I see about how this is going to integrate with large applications today is the ref counted producer thing. Like I understand there's like the share, I don't know, operator or pipe or something in RxJS land that helps you turn an observable that would ordinarily be cold, in the sense that every time you subscribe to it, it does the new thing and has side effects. And it allows you to basically share that among multiple consumers. And it sounds like what we're aiming for in the platform design is basically share built in. I'm getting a nod from Lars, so it sounds like I'm on the right track, maybe a little bit. And so I don't know if the easiest way to prepare for that integration is to just slap share everywhere in your application, make sure it works, and then it'll be a smooth transition to the native API, or that's something to think about. I don't have a lot of large Angular app experience. So I don't know exactly how these things look, but that's my mental framing of it so far.
Lars does, and he's a big RxJS fan. We have a bunch of Angular architects in here who have lots of experience on the ground. So we could start with Lars if you want after, but I want to hear from the Angular team as well and kind of get their feedback. And I'm curious like how this is going to change what they're doing on their end and questions.
Yeah, that'd be great to hear as well.
What do you think, Alex and Pawel?
So maybe I will just like start with maybe some reassurance, right? Like in the sense that like we are kind of asking questions about the